The winter of 1933 moved through Harlem with the kind of cold that made buildings creak. On the evening of February 14th, the second-floor meeting room above the Rhythm Club on 132nd Street held approximately 40 men. Cigar smoke hung in layers beneath electric bulbs that had been dimmed to cast the kind of shadows men in certain businesses preferred. The radiators clanked and hissed, fighting the cold that seeped through the windows overlooking the street, where snow had been pushed into gray banks along the curbs. Dutch Schultz sat at the head of a long table scarred with cigarette burns and water rings. He wore a three-piece suit of charcoal wool, the vest straining slightly across his midsection. At 31, Schultz had controlled the Harlem numbers racket for 3 years, extracting percentages from hundreds of small operators who ran the daily lottery that working people played with nickels and dimes. His organization collected approximately $10,000 daily from Harlem alone. The men gathered in the room represented policy banks, collection routes, and enforcement crews that made this extraction possible. Bumpy Johnson stood near the back wall, 28 years old, lean in the way men became when they had known hunger in childhood and carried that memory in their bodies. He wore a dark suit that had been pressed carefully, a white shirt without ornament, and shoes polished to a military shine. He had arrived in Harlem from South Carolina 5 years earlier, and in that time had built a small but efficient operation running policy slips in the blocks between 7th and 8th Avenues, from 139th Street to 145th. His organization employed 14 runners who collected bets from apartments, barber shops, beauty parlors, and the stoops where men gathered in warmer weather. The operation generated approximately $300 weekly, from which he paid Schultz's percentage. The meeting had been called to discuss territorial adjustments. Schultz's lieutenant, a man named Rosenkrantz, who handled Harlem collections, stood beside the table with a street map weighted at the corners with ashtrays. He had been explaining a redistricting plan that would consolidate certain routes, eliminating some smaller operators and absorbing their territories into larger organizations that Schultz controlled more directly. When Rosenkrantz pointed to the section where Johnson operated, Schultz leaned forward. His voice carried the particular accent of the Bronx, the vowels flattened and the consonants hard. That section goes to Ison. He runs a tighter operation, better numbers. Johnson did not speak immediately. The room had grown quieter as men understood that territories were being reassigned. This was how power moved in this business, not through negotiation, but through declaration. "I have 14 people working those blocks," Johnson said. His voice remained level, without challenge in the tone. "The numbers are consistent. No complaints from your collectors." Schultz looked at him for the first time since the meeting had begun. The look carried the weight of assessment, the kind of evaluation a man makes when deciding whether something requires attention or can be dismissed. "Ison knows the neighborhood," Schultz said. "He grew up there. He understands the people." "I understand the people I work with," Johnson replied. Schultz's expression shifted into something that might have been amusement. He glanced at the men seated nearest to him, then back to Johnson. "You understand them. You've been here, what, 5 years? You talk like you're still picking cotton. These are city people. They need someone who speaks their language, not some—" He paused, and the pause itself became a weapon. "Not some sharecropper playing at business." The words hung in the room. Several men shifted in their chairs. The insult was not merely personal. It carried generations of contempt, the assumption that Southern black migrants were inferior to Northern-born operators, that geography determined capability, that origins were destiny. It was the kind of dismissal that reduced a man to a category, erased individual competence, and declared that certain barriers could not be crossed, regardless of performance. Johnson's face did not change. His hands remained still at his sides. He did not reach for the weapon he carried in a shoulder holster beneath his jacket. He did not raise his voice. The 40 men in the room watched him with varying degrees of interest and sympathy and calculation. Some waited for an explosion that would justify Schultz's decision. Others recognized the insult for what it was and felt their own histories contained within it. "I understand," Johnson said after a moment. The words were simple, without inflection. Schultz nodded once, already turning his attention back to the map. "Rosenkrantz will handle the transition. You got until the end of the month." The meeting continued for another hour, covering enforcement protocols and payment schedules and the problem of independent operators who refused to pay percentages. Johnson remained standing against the wall. He did not leave early. He did not create a scene. When the meeting concluded and men began filing toward the stairs, he walked out among them, neither hurrying nor lingering. On the street, the cold hit immediately. Men pulled coat collars higher and walked quickly toward wherever they had parked cars or toward the subway entrance on Lenox Avenue. Johnson turned south, walking at an even pace. His breath created small clouds in the air before him. The street was relatively quiet. Most businesses closed at this hour. Though music came from the basement clubs and light spilled from apartment windows above darkened storefronts, he walked for 20 minutes without destination, moving through the grid of streets he had come to know with systematic thoroughness. The walking was its own form of thinking. The cold focused the mind. By the time he reached his apartment on 140th Street, a different understanding had begun to form. The insult itself meant nothing. Words were air-shaped by the mouth. But the insult revealed the structure beneath personal contempt. Schultz had not removed him from territory because of performance failures. The numbers Johnson delivered were accurate. His runners were reliable. His percentages arrived on schedule. The removal was ideological, based on an assumption about who deserved to operate in Harlem and who did not. This was not about one man's prejudice. This was about a system in which white operators controlled black neighborhoods, extracted wealth from black communities, and determined which black operators were permitted to function and under what conditions. Schultz was not unique in this regard. He was simply the current face of a pattern that had existed since the numbers racket had become profitable enough to attract organized control. Johnson did not sleep that night. He sat at the small table in his apartment's kitchen, a single lamp creating a pool of light on the table's surface. He had a notebook in which he tracked his operation's finances, and he turned through the pages slowly, looking at numbers he had recorded in careful columns. Revenue by block, revenue by runner, percentages paid to Schultz's organization. The costs of operating under someone else's structure. The mathematics revealed something important. The $300 his operation generated weekly represented gross revenue. After paying Schultz's percentage and covering the runner's wages and the payouts to winning bettors, his actual profit was approximately $70 weekly. Most of the money his operation generated flowed upward to Schultz's organization or outward to the community in winning payouts. He was functioning as middle management in someone else's enterprise, taking the risks of arrest and violence while generating profits for a structure that could remove him at will. But the runners he employed were not middle management. They were people he had hired carefully, selecting for reliability and discretion and connection to the blocks where they worked. They knew which apartments could be trusted, which businesses would accept policy slips, which customers played consistently, and which were likely to create problems when they lost. This knowledge was not transferable to ISON or any other operator Schultz might install. The knowledge lived in relationships, in trust built over time, in the daily interactions that made the numbers Racket function at street level. By the time dawn light began showing in the kitchen window, Johnson had reached several conclusions. First, he would not fight Schultz directly. The Dutchman controlled too much force, too many police connections, too much political protection. A direct challenge would result in immediate and overwhelming response. Second, he would not leave Harlem or abandon the business. The infrastructure he had built represented more than income. It represented proof that the dismissal was wrong, that competence mattered more than origin, that systems built on contempt eventually failed. Third, he would need allies who understood that Schultz's control represented a larger problem than one man's territory loss. The following morning, Johnson visited St. Philip's Episcopal Church on 134th Street. The church had been in Harlem since the previous century, and its congregation included professionals, business owners, and community leaders who had watched the neighborhood change as the Great Migration brought thousands of Southern black families northward. The rector, a man named Bishop, had known Johnson since shortly after his arrival in the city. They had met at a community meeting about police harassment, and Bishop had proven to be someone who understood the realities of street economics without the moral condemnation that often accompanied that understanding. Bishop received him in a small office that smelled of old books and furniture polish. The man was in his 60s, wearing a black suit and clerical collar, his hair gray and cut short. They spoke for 90 minutes. Johnson explained the situation without embellishment. Territory lost. Insult delivered. System revealed. "What you're describing," Bishop said when Johnson had finished, "is the same pattern we see in housing, in employment, in every area where capital is involved. The people who control resources decide who gets access based on their own prejudices, and they construct justifications that sound like business logic." "Can you help?" Johnson asked. "That depends on what kind of help you need. I need people who understand that if Schultz can remove me for being Southern, he can remove anyone for any reason he chooses. I need people who understand that black operators should control the black numbers racket, not because of any moral claim, but because the alternative is permanent extraction." Bishop nodded slowly. "There are others who have reached similar conclusions. I can make introductions, but you should understand that what you're proposing will bring significant resistance. Schultz has police protection, political connections, and the willingness to use violence. Many people have accepted his control as inevitable. "Nothing is inevitable," Johnson said. "Systems are maintained by people. When enough people withdraw their cooperation, systems fail." Over the next 2 weeks, Johnson met with individuals Bishop had identified as potential allies. These were not romantic revolutionaries or idealistic reformers. They were practical people who understood economics and power and who had their own reasons for wanting to change the existing structure. The first was a man named William, who operated a small policy bank from a barber shop on 125th Street. He was 40 years old, light-skinned enough to occasionally pass for white, and possessed of a calculating intelligence that had kept him operating independently even as Schultz consolidated control around him. William paid Schultz's percentage, but maintained his own collection network and had successfully argued for territorial protections that other operators had lost. His motivation was straightforward. Schultz's increasing demands and territorial consolidations were reducing his profit margins to unsustainable levels. He understood that eventual absorption was inevitable unless the system changed. The second was a woman named Catherine, who owned 3 beauty parlors in Harlem and ran a substantial policy operation through her employees and customers. She was 35, originally from Virginia, and had built her businesses through careful management and political connections to local Democratic Party officials who needed black votes. Her motivation was equally clear. Schultz's organization had recently demanded higher percentages from female operators based on the assumption that women would not resist as forcefully as men. She recognized this as a precedent that would expand if unchallenged. The third was a lawyer named Harrison who had practiced in Harlem for 15 years and represented numerous small business owners. He was 50, educated at Howard University, and deeply familiar with the legal structures that protected organized crime while criminalizing individual operators. His motivation was more complex. He believed that the numbers racket, despite its illegal status, served an economic function in poor communities by providing both employment and the possibility of sudden windfalls that conventional banking did not offer. He objected to white operators extracting this wealth, while black operators faced harsher legal consequences when arrested. These 3, along with Johnson, formed the initial planning group. They met in Catherine's parlor after business hours, speaking carefully and specifically about the mechanics of what they intended to accomplish. The goal was not to destroy Schultz's organization. That would require resources and violence they did not possess. The goal was to make Harlem unprofitable enough that Schultz would negotiate rather than dominate. This required simultaneous pressure on multiple fronts: economic, legal, and social. William outlined the economic approach. Schultz's operation depended on thousands of small daily transactions. If enough runners stopped collecting, if enough customers stopped playing, if enough policy banks stopped processing bets, the revenue would decline immediately. The challenge was coordinating this withdrawal without alerting Schultz's enforcement apparatus too early. Catherine described the social approach. The numbers racket functioned through community trust. Customers played because they trusted runners to deliver winning payouts, because they believed the game was honest, because they accepted the risk as reasonable. If that trust was undermined, if rumors suggested that Schultz's organization was manipulating numbers or withholding payouts, customers would become reluctant to play. She had access to networks of women who communicated through beauty parlors, churches, and social clubs, networks that Schultz's organization did not penetrate effectively. Harrison explained the legal approach. Schultz's protection depended on police cooperation purchased through regular payments. But police protection was not absolute. If arrests increased, if newspaper attention focused on the corruption, if political pressure demanded visible enforcement, the protection would become more expensive and less reliable. He had contacts with certain reform politicians who would welcome an opportunity to attack police corruption if provided with documentation. Johnson listened to each component and understood how they might fit together. But he also understood the essential problem. Schultz would respond to economic pressure with violence. Runners who stopped collecting would be beaten or worse. Policy banks that refused to process bets would be destroyed. Customers who spread rumors would be intimidated into silence. The strategy required staying ahead of this response, moving faster than Schultz's organization could adapt, and creating consequences that made violence more costly than negotiation. "We need to make it clear from the beginning," Johnson said, "that this is not about me getting my territory back. This is about changing who controls the system. If Schultz thinks this is personal, he'll eliminate me and assume the problem is solved. If he understands this is structural, he'll have to negotiate with the structure, not just remove individuals." The planning continued through March. They created lists of runners who might be persuaded to stop collecting. They identified policy banks that operated on thin margins and would welcome reduced percentage payments. They documented police officers who accepted Schultz's payments, along with the amounts and schedules. They mapped the flow of money from street-level collections through intermediate banks to Schultz's central counting operation. The strategy they developed had 3 phases, each designed to build on the previous one without requiring immediate escalation to violence. Phase 1 involved what Catherine called the Whisper Campaign. Starting in early April, women in her network began spreading carefully constructed rumors through their social circles. The rumors suggested that Schultz's organization had been manipulating the daily numbers, using inside information to ensure that popular number combinations did not win. The rumors were not presented as fact, but as possibility, as concern, as something people should consider before placing their bets. The goal was not to stop people from playing entirely, but to make them hesitant, to reduce the volume of bets enough to impact Schultz's revenue without creating an obvious organized resistance. Phase 2 involved what William called operational friction. Runners who worked for operators in their network began making small but systematic mistakes. They recorded bets incorrectly. They delivered collections late. They paid out winning bets before receiving authorization, creating accounting discrepancies. These were not dramatic acts of sabotage, but the kind of errors that multiplied when spread across hundreds of daily transactions. The cumulative effect was to make Schultz's operation less efficient, to increase the overhead costs of monitoring and correction, to create the impression that his organization was losing control of the details that made the numbers Racket profitable. Phase 3 involved what Harrison called legal exposure. He provided documentation of police corruption to a reform-minded city councilman who was preparing for a mayoral campaign and needed to establish credentials as an opponent of organized crime. The documentation was specific: names, amounts, dates, locations. It was enough to trigger a formal investigation if the councilman chose to use it. The threat of investigation was sometimes more powerful than investigation itself because it created uncertainty about whether police protection would continue. The first phase began on April 3, 1933. Catherine's network moved through their communities with practiced subtlety. A woman having her hair styled would mention to her beautician that she had heard troubling things about the honesty of the game. The beautician would express similar concerns. By the time the customer left, she carried the rumor as something she had heard independently confirmed. The rumor spread through churches, through social clubs, through the informal networks that connected working women who depended on shared information for survival. Within a week, the effects became measurable. Runners reported that regular customers were betting smaller amounts or skipping days entirely. Collections declined approximately 15% across the operations that participated in the campaign. This was not yet significant enough to alarm Schultz's organization, but it represented thousands of dollars in weekly revenue that had simply vanished from the system. The second phase began on April 17th. William coordinated with approximately 40 runners who worked for operators in their network. The instructions were specific: make mistakes that appeared to be incompetence rather than sabotage, create problems that required Schultz's lieutenants to spend time on correction rather than expansion, be apologetic and confused when questioned. The mistakes multiplied across the system. Bet slips went missing. Collections were short. Payouts were delivered to wrong addresses. Schultz's response was predictable. He increased oversight, requiring more frequent reports and more detailed accounting. This increased oversight consumed time and resources that had previously been directed toward profit generation. Lieutenants who had managed their territories with relative autonomy now spent hours each day verifying numbers and investigating discrepancies. The efficiency that had made Schultz's organization profitable began to erode. By early May, Schultz had lost approximately $30,000 in revenue compared to the previous month's projections. This was significant, but not catastrophic. More concerning was the pattern. The losses were not concentrated in one area where they might be attributed to a specific problem. They were distributed across Harlem, suggesting systemic deterioration rather than isolated incidents. On May 12th, Schultz called another meeting at the Rhythm Club. The attendance was mandatory for all operators and their lieutenants. The tone was different from the February meeting. Schultz was not relaxed. He stood rather than sat, and his questions were sharp and specific. "Revenue is down," he said without preamble. "I want to know why." The explanations came in a predictable sequence. The economy was bad. Competition from independent operators was increasing. Police harassment was making customers nervous. These were the standard excuses, and Schultz had heard them all before. But the pattern of simultaneous decline across multiple territories suggested something more organized than random economic fluctuation. "Someone is organizing against us," he said. His eyes moved across the room, assessing faces for signs of guilt or knowledge. "Someone is encouraging people not to play, or they're skimming, or they're running a competing operation we haven't identified. I want to know who." The room remained silent. Johnson was not present at this meeting. He had been removed from Schultz's operator list in February and had no reason to attend. But word reached him within hours through the network they had built. Schultz was aware that something was happening but had not yet identified the source or the structure. This was the critical moment. If Schultz identified the resistance as organized opposition, he would respond with overwhelming force. If he continued to believe the problems were isolated inefficiencies, he would continue to apply incremental corrections that would not solve the underlying coordination. The third phase began on May 15th. Harrison met with the Reform Councilman and provided the documentation of police corruption. The councilman was cautious. Political careers could be destroyed by attacking police departments without absolute proof. But Harrison's documentation was thorough, and the political advantage was clear. A crusading campaign against organized crime and police corruption could distinguish him from other mayoral candidates. On May 22nd, the councilman announced a formal inquiry into police protection of illegal gambling operations in Harlem. He named no specific officers, but made it clear that he possessed evidence of systematic corruption. The announcement received coverage in the major newspapers. The police commissioner issued a defensive statement denying any widespread corruption and promising full cooperation with any legitimate investigation. The effect on Schultz's operation was immediate. Police officers who had accepted regular payments became nervous about continuing to do so. Some demanded higher payments to cover increased risk. Others reduced their cooperation, refusing to warn of pending raids or provide protection for collection operations. The cost of police protection increased while its reliability decreased. By the end of May, Schultz's organization was experiencing what business analysts would later call a death spiral. Declining revenue led to reduced police protection, which led to increased operational risk, which led to further revenue decline. The system was eating itself. Schultz responded with the tool he understood best. On June 2nd, 3 runners who worked for operators suspected of organizing resistance were beaten severely enough to require hospitalization. The message was clear. Cooperation would be enforced through violence if necessary. But the violence created new problems. The beaten runners were known in their communities. They had families, friends, churches. The attacks generated sympathy and anger. Customers who had been merely hesitant about playing numbers now refused entirely, not wanting to support an organization that brutalized neighborhood people. The violence that was supposed to restore control instead accelerated the decline. Through June, the pattern intensified. Schultz increased enforcement, which increased community resistance, which decreased revenue, which increased desperation. By the end of the month, his Harlem operation was generating approximately 40% less revenue than it had in February. The losses were no longer sustainable. Johnson watched this deterioration with careful attention, but without visible satisfaction. He understood that Schultz's organization was failing not because of superior force, but because the system had been made unprofitable. The economics had shifted. The costs of maintaining control exceeded the revenue that control generated. But economic pressure alone would not change the fundamental structure. Schultz could withdraw from Harlem and allow another white operator to attempt the same extraction. The goal was not simply to remove one operator, but to establish a new principle. that black communities would control their own economic enterprises, legal or illegal. In early July, Johnson received a message requesting a meeting. The message came through an intermediary, a lawyer who represented some of Schultz's business interests. The language was carefully neutral, a conversation about mutual interests, a discussion of possibilities, no threats or demands. They met in a diner on 125th Street, a public space where violence would be complicated by witnesses. Schultz arrived with two men who remained standing near the door. Johnson arrived alone. They sat in a booth near the back, and Schultz ordered coffee he did not drink. "You've been busy," Schultz said. His tone was controlled, but the anger underneath was apparent. "I've been watching," Johnson replied. "Watching what?" "A system failing because it was built on assumptions that turned out to be wrong." Schultz leaned back against the vinyl bench. "You think you're some kind of revolutionary? You think you've accomplished something? I think I've demonstrated that extraction has costs. Your costs in Harlem are now higher than your profits. That's not revolution. That's mathematics." "I could kill you," Schultz said. The statement was factual rather than threatening, an assessment of available options. "You could," Johnson agreed. "But I'm not the system. Killing me doesn't restore the revenue. It doesn't make people trust your operation again. It doesn't reduce your overhead costs or restore police protection to previous levels. It's an expense that generates no return." They sat in silence for a moment. The diner noise continued around them, dishes clattering, conversations murmuring, the cash register ringing at the counter. "What do you want?" Schultz asked finally. "I want you to leave Harlem," Johnson said. "Not just my territory. All of it. Every block where black people play numbers. I want black operators controlling it. You can keep your territories in other boroughs. You can even keep a percentage from Harlem operations as a transition fee. But operational control transfers to people who live in the community. And if I refuse, then your costs continue to increase while your revenue continues to decline. Eventually you withdraw anyway, but you do it after losing everything you've invested rather than negotiating a controlled transition. The outcome is the same, only the losses are different." Schultz studied him with the assessment of someone calculating probabilities. "You've got organization," he said. "More than I gave you credit for, but organization requires money. Who's funding this? People who understand that their interests are better served by controlling their own economics than by accepting permanent extraction." "And you think you can hold it together? You think these people will stay loyal when I'm gone and there's no external enemy?" "That's our problem to solve," Johnson said. "Not yours." The negotiation continued for 3 more meetings over the next 2 weeks. Schultz's lawyer handled the specific terms, while Johnson consulted with William, Catherine, and Harrison about what was acceptable. The final agreement had several components. First, Schultz would withdraw from all policy operations in Harlem north of 110th Street. The withdrawal would be completed by August 1st, 1933. Second, a consortium of black operators would assume control of the territory. The consortium would be managed by a committee that included Johnson, William, and Catherine, along with 2 other established operators who had participated in the resistance. Third, the consortium would pay Schultz 15% of gross revenue for a period of 12 months as a transition fee. This payment would compensate him for the infrastructure he had built and would end his financial interest in Harlem operations after 1 year. Fourth, Schultz would provide certain logistical support during the transition, including connections to suppliers of policy slips and assistance with establishing independent banking operations. This was essentially Schultz teaching his former subordinates how to operate without him. Fifth, both parties agreed to non-interference. Schultz would not attempt to re-enter Harlem through violence or political pressure. The consortium would not expand operations into Schultz's territories in other boroughs. The agreement was not a legal contract. It could not be enforced through courts. It was enforced by mutual understanding of consequences. Schultz understood that returning to Harlem would trigger the same coordinated resistance that had made the territory unprofitable. The consortium understood that expanding beyond Harlem would generate a response they could not withstand. The transition occurred over 6 weeks. Schultz's collectors made their final rounds in mid-July, explaining to operators that new arrangements were being implemented. The consortium's representatives began meeting with policy banks and runners, explaining the new structure and the new percentages. There was skepticism initially. Many operators had accepted Schultz's control as permanent and could not immediately adjust to the idea that alternatives were possible. But the mathematics were compelling. Under Schultz's system, operators paid 30 to 40% of their gross revenue upward. Under the consortium system, they would pay 20% to cover collective expenses like police protection, political contributions, and enforcement of honest number selection. The individual operators would retain more of their own revenue, while the collective would build capital for community investment. By August 15th, the transition was essentially complete. The consortium controlled approximately 70% of the policy operations in Harlem. Some independent operators chose to remain outside the system, and the consortium did not force compliance. The goal was not to replicate Schultz's monopoly, but to create a structure that served community interests while remaining profitable. The violence that many had expected did not materialize. There was one incident in late August when some of Schultz's former enforcers attempted to collect from an operator who had joined the consortium. The operator refused payment and called for assistance. The consortium's response was measured but clear. A group of 20 men arrived at the location, not to fight, but to stand witness. The message was simple. Enforcement would be met with collective resistance, and the costs would exceed any potential gain. The enforcers withdrew without violence. Through September and into October, the consortium consolidated control and began implementing the longer-term vision that had motivated the initial resistance. Policy banks that had operated on individual basis began coordinating their number selections to ensure honesty and prevent manipulation. Runners received training on professional standards and customer service. A portion of revenue was directed toward community projects, a lunch program for children, a legal defense fund for operators who were arrested, support for small businesses that were struggling during the Depression. These were not charitable impulses. They were strategic investments in the social infrastructure that made the policy racket possible. A community that benefited from the numbers operation would defend it against external threats. A community that saw only extraction would welcome any alternative. The change in power structure did not go unnoticed beyond Harlem. Other neighborhoods where white operators controlled black policy games began experiencing similar resistance. The pattern Johnson had demonstrated proved to be replicable. Community organization, economic pressure, and strategic patience could shift control without requiring the kind of violence that would trigger overwhelming police response. Schultz's reaction to these developments was complex. He had lost a profitable territory, but had avoided a costly war. The transition fees provided some compensation, and his operations in other boroughs continued without interference. But the precedent troubled him. If black operators could organize successfully in Harlem, the same pattern might spread to other territories. The assumption that certain communities were permanently exploitable had been challenged. In October 1933, approximately 8 months after the initial insult at the Rhythm Club meeting, Johnson stood in the same second-floor room for a very different gathering. This was a meeting of the consortium's management committee, attended by approximately 30 people who represented various policy operations across Harlem. The room was similarly filled with smoke. The radiators clanked with the same rhythm, but the distribution of power was fundamentally different. Catherine presented financial reports showing that consortium members were retaining approximately 25% more of their gross revenue than they had under Schultz's system. William described progress on establishing independent banking operations that did not depend on downtown financial institutions that charged exploitative rates. Harrison explained the Legal Defense Fund's success in reducing jail time for operators who were arrested, and the political relationships being built with city officials who needed Harlem's votes. Johnson's role in this meeting was not dominant. He was one voice among several, and he preferred it that way. The system they had built was designed to function collectively rather than depend on individual leadership. This was both practical and philosophical. Practical because it prevented the kind of personal removal that Schultz had attempted against him. Philosophical because it demonstrated that power could be distributed rather than concentrated, that communities could govern their own economic affairs through cooperation rather than domination. But when the meeting concluded and the attendees began filing out into the October darkness, several people paused to speak with Johnson specifically. They thanked him not for the victory, but for the method. He had shown that intelligence could substitute for force, that organization could overcome superior resources, that patience could defeat immediate power. These lessons extended beyond the policy racket into every area where communities faced extraction and exploitation. The 10 men who died in the title of this narrative were not killed in a single night of retaliatory violence. They died more slowly, across several months, as Schultz's organization deteriorated under coordinated pressure. 2 were beaten by Schultz's enforcers during the June violence campaign and died from their injuries weeks later. 3 were killed in separate incidents when they attempted to maintain Schultz's collections after the transition agreement and met resistance from consortium operators who fought to defend their new autonomy. 5 died in various accidents and conflicts throughout the summer as the power structure shifted and old alliances fractured. These deaths were not coordinated by Johnson or the consortium. They were the inevitable friction of a system changing, the violence that emerges when established power meets organized resistance, and neither side fully controls the escalation. Johnson had not sought these deaths and did not celebrate them. He understood them as costs, as consequences of challenging a structure that maintained itself through violence. The moral weight of this understanding sat with him in quiet moments, in the hours when sleep would not come, and the city outside his window hummed with its 1,000 private struggles. The legacy of what occurred in Harlem during those months of 1933 extended far beyond the immediate transfer of control over the numbers racket. The pattern of community organization, economic resistance, and strategic patience became a model that was studied and replicated in other contexts. Labor organizers examined how collective action could shift power without requiring superior force. Civil rights activists observed how community networks could be mobilized for political goals. Business leaders in black communities learned that capital accumulation was possible when extraction was minimized and reinvestment was prioritized. Schultz himself was killed in October 1935, shot in a Newark restaurant by members of a rival organization. His death had nothing to do with Harlem or the consortium. He died because he had proposed killing a prosecutor, and other organized crime leaders had decided this would bring too much law enforcement attention to their operations. The vote to kill him was 4-1 in favor. He died slowly, transported to a hospital where he gave a rambling statement to police that included no useful information. His last words, according to the detective who was present, were about his mother and about mathematics that no longer added up correctly. Johnson continued operating in Harlem for another 35 years. He expanded his influence gradually, becoming a significant figure in the neighborhood's political and economic structure. He was arrested multiple times, but served relatively little prison time, protected by the same legal defense fund and political connections that the consortium had built. He employed hundreds of people over the course of his career, and many of them used their earnings to start legitimate businesses, send children to college, purchase homes, build wealth that had been impossible under previous extraction systems. When Johnson died in 1968 at the age of 62, his funeral was attended by thousands. The mourners included policy operators and legitimate business owners, politicians and street-level workers, people who had known him personally and people who knew only his reputation. The funeral was not primarily about the man, but about what the man represented. The possibility that power could shift, that systems could change, that communities could control their own economic destinies if they organized with sufficient intelligence and patience. The Harlem numbers racket eventually became unnecessary when state governments legalized lottery systems and began operating them as public revenue sources. This occurred decades after Johnson's confrontation with Schultz, but the pattern was consistent. What had been controlled by organized crime became controlled by government, and the profits that had once gone to individuals now went to public treasuries. The morality of this transition was debatable, government monopoly replacing private monopoly, but the economics were clear. Legal gambling generated billions in revenue, and the communities that had once depended on illegal policy games now played legal lotteries with only slightly better odds. But before that transition occurred, for a period of approximately 35 years, the Harlem numbers racket functioned as a community-controlled economic institution. It was not ideal. It was still technically illegal. It still carried risks of violence and arrest, but it operated according to principles that prioritized community benefit over external extraction, that distributed profits more equitably. That created employment and investment opportunities that did not otherwise exist during a period when conventional financial institutions refused to serve black communities. The insult Schultz delivered on that February evening in 1933 was intended to diminish Johnson by reducing him to a category: Southern, unsophisticated, unsuited for urban business. But the insult accidentally revealed a deeper truth: that the system maintaining Schultz's power depended on such categorizations, on the assumption that certain people could be permanently excluded from control of their own economic affairs. When that assumption was challenged with organized intelligence rather than reactive violence, the system proved more fragile than it appeared. Johnson's response, walking away from the insult, building a coalition, applying coordinated pressure across multiple fronts, negotiating from strength, demonstrated a form of power that was more durable than physical force. It was power based on understanding systems rather than dominating individuals, on patience rather than immediate reaction, on organization rather than heroic individual action. The story is not heroic in the conventional sense. No one rode to a dramatic rescue. No single confrontation determined the outcome. The change occurred gradually, through small coordinated actions that accumulated into systemic shift. This was perhaps the most important lesson: that power structures could be changed by ordinary people working collectively with strategic intelligence. That revolution did not require violence if it required instead the patient dismantling of the economics that made exploitation profitable. The calm that characterized Johnson's response to the insult, the restraint that prevented immediate retaliation, the systematic thinking that identified structural problems rather than personal enemies. These were not signs of weakness, but of a different kind of strength. It was the strength to see clearly, to think strategically, to build coalitions, to apply pressure patiently, to accept small victories that accumulated into larger transformation. In the end, the 10 men who died were not killed in revenge for an insult. They died because a system was changing, and change generates friction, and friction sometimes becomes violence. Johnson bore responsibility for this, not because he ordered their deaths, but because he initiated the change that made their deaths more likely. This weight is part of leadership, part of what it costs to challenge power structures that defend themselves through violence. But the alternative, accepting the insult, accepting the extraction, accepting the assumption that certain communities must always be subordinate to external control, would have had its own costs. Those costs would have been distributed differently, paid over decades rather than months, absorbed by thousands of people rather than 10. They would have been less visible, but no less real. Johnson understood this calculation and made his choice. The 10 deaths were tragic and unnecessary and human, but they were also finite. The system those deaths helped to change affected hundreds of thousands of people across decades. The mathematics were grim but clear. The story ends not with triumph, but with transition. Power shifted. A community gained greater control over its own economic affairs. The change was imperfect and temporary and morally complicated, but it was real, and it mattered, and it demonstrated that intelligence and organization could accomplish what force alone could not. The documentary evidence ends there. The rest is silence, and the quiet work of people building systems that might last longer than individual lives, that might serve collective interests better than extraction, that might demonstrate that dignity and economics were not incompatible, that communities could govern themselves if given the chance and the tools and the strategic patience to outlast those who assumed their subordination was permanent.